His elbow cracked against her skull plates, exploded across the tile, and the entire diner went dead silent. She didn't scream. She just stood there, hand to her swelling eye, while the door behind him slowly opened. And when Franco Davila stepped inside and saw the blood, Ethan Henry had exactly 60 seconds left as the owner of that restaurant. If this story pulled you in, go ahead and subscribe so you never miss what's ahead. I've got another unforgettable story coming tomorrow. And while you're here, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. I love seeing people tuned in from all over the world. Okay, let's get back into it. Riley's Diner had never been the kind of place that asked anything of you. It sat on the corner of Aldwych and Fifth, like it had always been there, and always intended to stay a low, rectangular building with smudged plate glass windows, wood-paneled walls, the color of old caramel, and round pendant lights that cast everything in a warm amber glow that made tired people feel slightly less tired. The laminate tabletops were scuffed at the edges. The chrome chair legs wobbled if you leaned wrong. The coffee had usually been sitting too long, but nobody who came to Riley's came for the coffee. They came because it was the kind of place where a working person could breathe for 45 minutes without the world demanding something in return. Aubrey Hilda moved through the dinner rush the way she always did, quietly, efficiently, without wasted motion. She was a young woman with dark hair pulled back from her face, and the particular kind of stillness that comes not from peace, but from practice. Her black uniform shirt and gray apron were clean despite the hour. Her eyes moved ahead of her hands, always tracking the next table, the next tray, the next thing that needed doing. There was a thin, faded mark near her left eyebrow barely visible under the diner light that most customers never noticed, and none ever asked about. She did not invite questions. That had always suited her fine. The room was full tonight. Every booth along the wood-paneled wall held at least 2 people. A man in a dark jacket sat alone at a corner table near the window, nursing a coffee he'd barely touched, his eyes drifting between his phone and the street outside. A woman near the back had her hand pressed to her mouth, already watching something across the room with an expression that hadn't quite decided between discomfort and dread. The hum of conversation filling the space was the ordinary, unpretentious sound of a neighborhood eating dinner. Then Ethan Henry came across the floor, and the hum began to die. He was a broad man in his 50s, gray-haired and heavy through the shoulders, with the permanently flushed complexion of someone who treated every small frustration as a personal attack. His shirt was open at the collar. His jaw was already set. Customers who had been coming to Riley's long enough knew what that jaw meant, and those sitting nearest the counter had already dropped their eyes toward their plates, with the practiced invisibility of people who understood that being noticed right now was not in their interest. Ethan had owned the diner for 11 years. In that time, 2 waitresses had filed complaints against him with the labor board, both resolved quietly, both in his favor. A line cook had quit without notice the previous winter and refused to give a forwarding address. The health inspector came twice a year, found things, accepted Ethan's explanations, and left. He had built, inside these 4 walls, the specific and suffocating kind of authority that only exists when the people beneath it cannot afford to push back. Aubrey had known all of this when she took the job 8 months ago. She had taken it anyway. The billing error was minor, a table charged twice for a side order, the discrepancy surfacing during the register reconciliation. That was the whole of it. But Ethan had found the mistake during a moment when everything else had already gone wrong for him that day. And a minor thing in the wrong moment had a way of becoming something larger inside a man like Ethan Henry. He came across the dining room floor at a pace that parted people without requiring him to ask. His face had gone the deep, blotchy red of something about to boil over. Aubrey heard him before she saw him, heard the particular rhythm of his footsteps, heavy and deliberate, and she turned from the table she was clearing, with the tray still balanced in both hands. She didn't have time to set it down. Ethan's arm swung as he turned toward her, a wide, backhanded arc, elbow raised and dropping, and the impact caught her on the right side of her head just above the ear, with a force that had no business being accidental. The sound it made was a dense, flat crack that cut through every conversation in the room simultaneously, the way a single sharp noise in a quiet space always does, arriving before the mind has time to understand it. The tray left Aubrey's hands. Plates struck the tile floor and shattered. A fork bounced off the side of a table and spun under a booth. The clatter rolled through the room and then stopped, and the silence that replaced it was total, the kind of silence that has weight to it, that presses down on the people inside it and holds them very still. Aubrey had stumbled into the edge of the counter. Her right hand found it and gripped. Her left came up to cover the side of her head, instinctive, automatic, and she stood there with her eyes squeezed shut and her teeth pressed together, and her breath coming through her nose in a careful, controlled rhythm. The skin above her ear was already beginning to swell, an angry heat blooming outward from the point of impact. She did not cry out. She did not collapse. She just stood there, jaw set, hand pressed to her head in the particular way of someone who has learned through long, hard experience that showing pain in front of the wrong person only tells them they've found something that works. The woman near the back had both hands over her mouth now. The man in the dark jacket at the corner table had risen halfway from his seat. Ethan stood in the center of the floor, chest heaving, not yet understanding what his anger had just cost him. The whole room held its breath. The front door opened. No announcement, no entourage. Just the door swinging inward on the quiet evening air, and a man stepping through it into the amber light, lean and dark-haired, in a well-cut black suit with no tie, tattoos climbing the side of his neck and disappearing beneath his collar. He was not large the way Ethan was large. He was large in a different way entirely, the kind that has nothing to do with weight and everything to do with the stillness a person carries when they have spent a long time being the most dangerous thing in whatever room they enter. Franco Davila's eyes swept the room once unhurried, complete. They found the shattered plates. They found Ethan, still flushed and breathing in the center of the floor. And then they found Aubrey, hand pressed to the side of her face, jaw locked tight, the swelling already rising above her eye. Franco went very still. He had not planned to come here tonight. He had told himself it was impulse, that he was simply passing, that it meant nothing. But the truth, the quiet truth he had carried for 6 months without examining too closely, was that he had been thinking about her, about what she had done for him on a cold street the previous autumn, without being asked, without wanting anything in return. He had told her that night, "If anyone ever touches you, you call me." She never called. She hadn't needed to. 6 months earlier, Aubrey Hilda had not been thinking about heroism. She had been thinking about her feet. It was the particular, bone-deep ache that came after a double shift, the kind that started in the heels and worked its way up through the calves and settled somewhere behind the knees by the time the last table was wiped down and the apron was untied. She had worked 11 hours. She had smiled when smiling was required and stayed invisible when invisibility was safer. And now, all she wanted was the 12-minute walk home, a shower that stayed hot longer than it should, and silence. The city offered her none of those things easily. It rarely did. It was the kind of autumn evening that couldn't decide what it wanted to be, too warm for the season, too cool for comfort. The air carrying the particular restlessness of a night that had not yet finished with itself. The streets in this part of the city thinned out after 9. Streetlights threw long yellow columns across wet pavement. Somewhere behind her, a bus pulled away from a stop with a tired hydraulic exhale. Aubrey walked with her head down and her hands in her jacket pockets, and paid attention the way people who have learned to pay attention always do, not anxiously, not obviously, but constantly. It was a habit she had developed young and never lost. The kind of awareness that doesn't announce itself. It simply watches. That was why she noticed the car. It was parked along the curb on the east side of the block, a dark sedan, engine off, no one visible in the front seats. Ordinary enough. Except for the 2 men positioned behind it. They were standing too still. That was the thing. People who are waiting for something, a cab, a friend, a light to change, have a particular restlessness to them. A small, constant movement. These 2 men had none of that. Their stillness was deliberate, practiced. Their hands were visible but too quiet, and their eyes were locked forward with the kind of singular focus that belongs to people who have already made a decision and are simply waiting for the moment to execute it. Aubrey slowed without stopping. She followed the line of their gaze across the street. A black car had pulled up to the curb on the opposite side. The driver's door was opening. A man was stepping out, tall, dark-jacketed, moving with the unhurried ease of someone accustomed to arriving places and having the room adjust itself accordingly. He was reaching back into the car for something. His back was to the street. Even from across the road, Aubrey knew who he was. Everyone knew who Franco Davila was. You didn't need to have met him. You didn't need to have any connection to the world he moved through. His name existed in the city the way certain weather patterns do present in conversations, felt in the atmosphere, understood without explanation. He was not the kind of man who required an introduction. He also, in this particular moment, had no idea what was about to happen behind him. The two men had shifted. Their weight had moved forward. Their hands were no longer quiet. Aubrey processed all of this in the space of perhaps 2 seconds. Later, she would not be able to explain the decision with any precision. She would not be able to point to a moment of deliberation, a moral calculation, a conscious act of courage. There was none of that. There was only the sudden, wordless understanding that something was about to happen, and that she was the only person in the street who could see all of it at once, and then her body was already moving before her mind had finished forming the thought. She ran, not away, toward. She crossed the street in 7 or 8 strides, and the sound of her footsteps must have registered somewhere in Franco's awareness, because he was beginning to turn when she hit him shoulder into his ribs, her full weight driving forward, and the force of it took them both down hard onto the pavement, just as the gunshots tore through the air above them. 2 shots, then a third. The sound of them was enormous and immediate, and then the street was chaos. A car alarm triggered somewhere down the block. A woman screamed from a window above, and the 2 men were running, moving fast between parked cars and disappearing into the dark between 2 buildings, before the echo had finished bouncing off the facades. Aubrey was on her hands and knees on the wet pavement. Her palms were scraped. Her shoulder ached from the impact. She was breathing in short, sharp pulls, not from fear exactly, but from the physical shock of what her body had just done without asking her permission. Franco Davila was beside her, already rising, controlled, precise, his eyes moving to the street where the men had been, cataloging, processing. There was a cut on his jaw from the pavement. He didn't seem to notice it. He looked at her. For a long moment, he simply looked at her, this young woman in a waitress uniform, with scraped hands, and a wild expression, and absolutely no business being in the middle of any of this. "You're bleeding," he said. "So are you?" she said. His security arrived 90 seconds later. 2 black vehicles, men in dark jackets moving with the organized urgency of people who were furious at themselves. They swept the area. They made calls. They created, in the space of 3 minutes, the kind of controlled perimeter that made it clear this portion of the evening was now being handled by people whose job was handling things. Franco stood apart from it. He was still watching her. He offered her money. She said no. He offered a car to take her home. She accepted that, but only as far as the end of her street. He offered protection, a number to call, people who would make certain she was never inconvenienced by the world he moved through. She listened to all of it, with the particular patience of someone who had already made up their mind. "I don't want that kind of arrangement," she said quietly. "I have a job. I'm fine." He studied her for a moment. Then he nodded slowly, the way a man nods when he has encountered something he didn't expect and is deciding how to hold it. "If anyone ever touches you," he said, "you call me." She looked at him steadily. "I won't need to," she said. She believed it when she said it. She was wrong. Franco Davila had walked into many rooms in his life. Rooms where men twice his age sat behind mahogany desks and tried to read his intentions before he spoke. Rooms where the air was thick with cigarette smoke and unspoken threats, and the particular tension of negotiations that had no good outcome for anyone present. Rooms where people smiled at him with their mouths, while their eyes calculated angles of exit. He had learned, over many years and at considerable cost, how to read a room the way other men read text quickly, completely, without missing the subtext beneath the surface. He read Riley's diner in under 4 seconds. The shattered plates on the tile floor, the frozen customers, forks suspended halfway between table and mouth, the woman near the back with both hands pressed over her lips, the man in the dark jacket at the corner table who had risen from his seat and then thought better of it and slowly sat back down, the amber ceiling lights that had been warm and ordinary 10 minutes ago and now felt like the lighting of a theater stage mid-scene, and Ethan Henry, broad-shouldered, gray-haired, still flushed and breathing audibly in the center of the room, standing over what he had done with the particular posture of a man who had not yet processed that the ground beneath him had shifted. And Aubrey, hand pressed to the side of her head, gray apron slightly askew, the swelling already darkening the skin above her right eye into something that would be ugly by morning. She was standing straight. She had not sat down, had not leaned against anything, had not allowed herself the visible relief of letting her body admit what had just been done to it. Her jaw was set in that way he recognized from a wet pavement 6 months ago, the expression of someone who refuses, on principle, to be seen breaking. Franco crossed the threshold and let the door fall shut behind him. He did not rush. He never rushed. Rushing communicated panic, and panic communicated weakness, and neither of those things had any place in the vocabulary his presence was built from. He walked the way he always walked, with the unhurried, deliberate pace of a man who understands that the room will wait for him, because the room always does. The conversations that had already died did not restart. Ethan recognized him. Franco watched it happen, watched the color drain from the outer edges of that flushed face, watched the jaw that had been set with authority slowly lose its certainty, watched the eyes make the calculation and arrive somewhere between confusion and the very earliest, most unwilling stages of fear. Ethan was not a stupid man. He had simply, until this moment, been operating in a world where his particular brand of power had no natural predator. That world had just ended. Franco did not look at Ethan. Not yet. He walked directly to Aubrey, and he stopped in front of her, and for a moment he simply looked at her the way he had looked at her on that street, with the full, careful attention of a man taking inventory of something that matters. The swelling above her eye was worse up close. There was a small split in the skin at the top of it, just beginning to surface. The hand she had pressed to her face was trembling slightly, not from weakness, he understood, but from the physical effort of holding everything together in a room full of strangers while her body processed pain it hadn't been asked to absorb. "Did he do this?" Franco asked. His voice was quiet. It always was. He had learned long ago that quiet voices in loud moments carried further than shouting ever could. Aubrey looked at him. Something moved behind her eyes, surprise first, then something more complicated. The particular expression of a person who has spent months telling themselves they needed nothing from anyone and has just been confronted with evidence that the world disagrees. She hesitated. It was a small hesitation, only a breath long, the hesitation of someone weighing the cost of admission against the cost of denial. He waited. He was patient with her in a way he was patient with very few people. Then she nodded. Once. Small. Definitive. That was enough. Franco turned. He turned slowly. The way you turn when there is no urgency because the outcome is already decided, and everyone in the room who is paying attention already knows it. He looked at Ethan Henry for the first time since walking through the door, and he held that gaze for a moment that lasted considerably longer than it needed to. Ethan opened his mouth. Franco raised one hand barely, just a slight elevation of the palm, and Ethan's mouth closed. "Lock the doors," Franco said. He said it without raising his voice or turning his head. He said it the way a man says things when he has people around him whose entire function is to hear him say things and make them happen. Two men who had entered quietly behind him and taken up positions near the entrance, without anyone quite noticing when moved to the door. The deadbolt turned. The open sign in the window, those bright red letters visible from the street, clicked off. The sound of the bolt was small. In the silence of that room it was enormous. A customer near the window shifted in his seat. One of Franco's men looked at him, not threateningly, not with any expression at all, and the customer stopped shifting and looked back at his plate. Ethan was breathing differently now. The flush in his face had undergone a transformation, no longer the red of anger, but the red of something far less comfortable. He was a man who had built 11 years of small dominance inside these four walls, and he was experiencing, perhaps for the first time, what it felt like to be inside a room that no longer belonged to him. Franco looked at Aubrey once more. The swelling above her eye, the careful, controlled stillness of her, the way she stood in the wreckage of the tray she had been carrying, surrounded by the shattered evidence of what had been done to her, and refused to look like a victim. He had told her 6 months ago on a cold street, "If anyone ever touches you, you call me." She hadn't called, but fate, it turned out, had its own sense of timing. He turned back to Ethan. "You hit her," Franco said. The words were soft, almost gentle. They landed in the room like stones dropped into still water, quiet on entry, but the ripples moved outward and touched every wall. Ethan opened his mouth again. "She works for me. It was a mistake," she disrespected. "You hit her," Franco said again. Same words, same quiet, no variation in tone whatsoever. But this time, the weight behind them was different. This time, it carried everything 6 months of memory. One cold pavement, bullets tearing through dark air, a young woman with scraped palms who had asked for nothing and been given a promise in return. The promise was being kept now. Ethan just didn't know yet how much that was going to cost him. Ethan Henry had not always been this man. That was the thing about him that nobody in Riley's diner knew, because nobody in Riley's diner had known him long enough, and because the version of himself he had become over 11 years had buried the earlier version so thoroughly that even Ethan himself rarely encountered it anymore, only occasionally, late at night, in the particular quiet that follows a second drink, when the defenses came down just enough to let something older and softer surface briefly before he pushed it back down. He had opened the diner at 41 with borrowed money and genuine hope. That was the truth of it. The uncomfortable, inconvenient truth that sat beneath everything else like a foundation crack present, structural, ignored. He had wanted, in the beginning, to build something honest, a neighborhood place, somewhere that fed people and employed people, and existed as a small, decent contribution to the fabric of a city that had more than enough indecency already. He had that in him once, the wanting of good things. The borrowed money had come from 3 sources: a bank loan at an interest rate that seemed manageable until the first slow season hit, a private investor, a quiet man named Aldrich Bauer, who wore good shoes and asked very few questions, and expected, in return, a monthly arrangement that Ethan had not fully understood the implications of until he was already 18 months in, and the paperwork was long signed. And his own savings, 11 years of working for other people in other kitchens, set aside carefully, spent in 6 months. The slow seasons kept coming. A kitchen fire in year 3 cost him $40,000 and 3 weeks of closure. A failed health inspection in year 5, genuinely accidental. A refrigeration unit that failed overnight cost him his liquor license for 4 months, and the dinner crowd that had only just begun to solidify. A lawsuit from a former employee in year 7, filed by a woman who had worked the morning shift and claimed wrongful termination, settled quietly out of court for a sum that Ethan paid in installments that were still, technically, ongoing. Each of these things had taken something from him. Not just money, something else, something harder to name and harder to replace. The slow, grinding accumulation of financial pressure had done to Ethan Henry what it does to certain kinds of men. It had converted his fear into aggression and his vulnerability into cruelty, and it had done both of these things so gradually that there had never been a single moment he could point to and say, "That is where I changed." It had happened the way erosion happens, quietly, continuously, without announcement. He had started small. A sharper tone with staff when orders were wrong. A coldness that replaced what had once been patience. The first time he raised his voice at an employee in front of customers, a waitress named Petra, who had been with him since year 2, he had apologized afterward genuinely, uncomfortably, with real remorse. Petra had accepted the apology and given her notice 2 weeks later. He did not apologize the second time. By year 8, the staff turnover at Riley's was the highest it had ever been. By year 9, he had stopped interviewing candidates and simply hired whoever applied, because the pool of people willing to work for him had narrowed considerably. By year 10, the complaints had started 2 formal ones, filed with the labor board, both navigated with the help of a lawyer whose fees went onto a credit card that was already carrying more than it should. The complaints disappeared. The debt did not. Aldrich Bauer's monthly arrangement had evolved over 11 years into something with considerably more teeth than the original paperwork suggested. The loan from the bank had been refinanced twice. The credit card carried a balance that Ethan looked at on the 1st of every month, and then closed the browser tab on before his mind could fully process the number. The restaurant was, on paper, operational. In reality, it was a man standing in a hole he had been digging for 11 years, occasionally glancing up at the edges and telling himself the hole wasn't that deep. He had mistaken the fear for power. That was the specific and catastrophic error. The aggression that fear had produced in him, the raised voice, the public humiliation of staff, the physical intimidation that had escalated so gradually, he had convinced himself it was simply the language of a man running a demanding business, had created around him a radius of compliance that he had interpreted as respect. People did what he said. People flinched when he raised his voice. People showed up for shifts they dreaded because they needed the wage and had no better option. He had read all of that as authority. He had not understood the difference between a room that respects you and a room that is simply afraid of you, and he had lived inside that misunderstanding for so long that it had become the architecture of his identity. Now he stood in the center of his own diner, his tables, his lights, his floor, and watched a man he had never spoken to give a quiet instruction that locked his doors and flipped his sign to closed, and felt, for the first time in years, the specific and nauseating sensation of being genuinely powerless. He was beginning to understand what his staff had felt every day. The thought arrived without welcome, and he pushed it away. Franco had not moved far. He stood at a slight distance, not crowding, not performing threat. He didn't need to. His 2 men were near the entrance. The customers were seated and still. The room, which had been Ethan's kingdom 20 minutes ago, had been reorganized around a different center of gravity without a single loud word being spoken. Ethan's phone buzzed in his pocket. He didn't reach for it. Something told him, in the specific animal way that something tells you things when the conscious mind is still catching up, that reaching for his phone right now would be the wrong movement. That stillness was safer. That waiting was the only currency he had left. The phone buzzed again, and then a 3rd time. Franco glanced at it, not at the phone itself, but at the pocket it was in. A brief, almost bored glance. Then he looked back at Ethan with an expression that was worse than anger. It was patience, the deep, unhurried patience of a man who already knows how everything ends and is simply allowing time to catch up to the outcome he has already decided. Ethan's phone buzzed a 4th time. This time, the caller ID, had he looked, would have shown a number registered to the city's Department of Health and Safety Services. A routine call, the kind that gets placed when a specific kind of report is filed. Urgent. Flagged for immediate follow-up. The first stone had been dropped into the water. The ripples were already moving. The first inspector arrived at 8:47. Ethan heard the knock before he saw the door. A sharp, official knock. The kind that carries its own authority. The kind that does not wait to be acknowledged before repeating itself. One of Franco's men opened it without looking at Ethan for permission, and a woman in a city-issued jacket stepped inside with a clipboard, and the particular expression of someone who has been doing a job long enough that nothing surprises them anymore. She did not introduce herself immediately. She looked around the room first at the shattered plates, still on the floor, at the customers sitting in a silence that had long stopped being comfortable, at the open sign dark in the window, and she wrote something on her clipboard before she said a word. "Department of Health and Safety," she said finally. "We've received a report. I'll need access to the kitchen." Ethan moved toward her. "This is my establishment. You can't just—" "Sir." She looked at him with the calm, immovable patience of a municipal employee who has been interrupted mid-sentence by restaurant owners many times before and has developed an institutional immunity to it. "I have authorization. The kitchen, please." Ethan looked at Franco. It was involuntary, the look. He hadn't intended it, hadn't decided to do it, but his eyes moved to Franco the way eyes move toward the most powerful thing in a room, when the mind is overwhelmed and looking for something to orient itself against. Franco was standing near the counter, arms loose at his sides, watching the exchange with the expression of a man observing something mildly interesting. A chess match, perhaps, between players of unequal skill. Franco said nothing. He didn't need to. The inspector disappeared into the kitchen. For the next 11 minutes, the only sounds from behind the serving window were the opening and closing of storage units, the scratch of pen on paper, and occasional photographs being taken with a camera phone. Ethan stood in the center of his dining room and listened to each sound the way a man listens to a doctor moving through his home, cataloging everything. He knew what she would find. Not catastrophes. Nothing that would have mattered on an ordinary Tuesday evening, when no one was looking closely. The refrigeration unit in the back corner ran 3 degrees warmer than it should. It had been doing so for 6 weeks, and Ethan had been meaning to call the repair service, had written the number on a post-it that was still stuck to the edge of the register. The dry storage had a moisture issue along the baseboard that had produced a small but documentable patch of something that would photograph badly. The ventilation hood above the grill had not been professionally cleaned in 14 months. The regulation required 12. Small things, each one individually navigable. Each one, on a normal evening, the kind of thing that gets a warning notice and a 30-day compliance window and is forgotten by the following month. But nothing about this evening was normal. His phone rang again while the inspector was still in the kitchen. This time he looked at it. A different number 1 he recognized with a specific, sinking recognition that started somewhere in his chest and moved downward. It was the number for Meridian Financial, the lending company that held the note on the equipment, the commercial ovens, the refrigeration units, the dishwashing system. A note he was currently 11 weeks behind on. An arrangement he had been managing through a series of extensions granted by a patient account manager named Jeffrey, who returned his calls and accepted his explanations and had, until now, been willing to wait. Jeffrey, apparently, was no longer willing to wait. Ethan declined the call. Franco watched him decline it. "You should answer," Franco said quietly. It was the first thing he had said in several minutes, and the room received it the way rooms receive sounds in silence completely, with full attention. "It's a financial matter," Ethan said. His voice came out smaller than he intended. "Yes," Franco agreed, "it is." The simplicity of it was devastating. No threat embedded in the words, no menace in the delivery, just a plain acknowledgement that carried the weight of complete information, the specific, crushing weight of a man confirming that he knows exactly which walls are load-bearing and has already made arrangements for each one. Ethan understood then, with a clarity that arrived too late to be useful, that the phone calls were not coincidental, that the inspector had not arrived because someone at the Department of Health and Safety had happened to be monitoring Riley's diner on this particular evening, that Meridian Financial's sudden urgency after 11 weeks of patience was not a scheduling coincidence. Franco did not break bones. He had said it once to a man in a different city, in a different room, many years ago, and the man had not understood it until much later. "I do not break bones when I can break foundations." Violence was loud and visible and created complications, witnesses, reports, the involvement of people and systems that took time and energy to manage. It was, in Franco's considered view, an inefficient tool, best left to men of limited imagination. He preferred architecture. The architecture of pressure. The careful, precise application of existing systems, regulatory, financial, legal, social, to structures that were already compromised. You did not need to destroy a building that had cracks in its foundation. You simply needed to know where the cracks were and apply the right weight in the right places and allow physics to complete the work. Ethan Henry's building had cracks everywhere. The inspector emerged from the kitchen at 9:03 with 4 pages of notes and a formal notice that she placed on the counter with the practiced efficiency of someone who has placed many such notices on many such counters. She explained, briefly and without particular emotion, that the establishment would be required to address the cited violations within 72 hours, or face temporary closure pending reinspection. She left without looking at Franco once. Ethan stared at the notice. His phone buzzed again. A text this time, from a number he didn't recognize, containing 4 words that arrived in the specific order, guaranteed to produce maximum damage in minimum characters. "Tax irregularities. Call us. Urgent." He set the phone face down on the counter. Across the room, a customer quietly asked one of Franco's men if they could leave. The man looked at Franco. Franco nodded once. The customer gathered their coat and left quickly, not making eye contact with anyone. Then another couple left. Then an older man near the window. The room was emptying. Quietly, steadily, the way air leaves a punctured thing not all at once, but continuously, without stopping. Ethan watched it go. 11 years. Every table, every scratch on every surface, every early morning and late night and season that had ground something out of him and taken something he hadn't budgeted for losing. All of it coming apart, not with violence, not with noise, just with patience and phone calls and the quiet, terrible efficiency of a man who had decided that Ethan Henry's foundation needed to feel some weight. It was feeling it now. They took her to St. Ambrose Hospital at 9:21. Not in an ambulance. Aubrey had refused that, quietly and firmly, in the way she refused most things that drew attention to her. One of Franco's men had brought a car around to the side entrance of the diner, and she had walked to it herself, upright, her hand no longer pressed to her face because she had decided, somewhere in the previous hour, that she was done letting anyone in that room see her holding herself together. If she was going to fall apart, she would do it in private. She always had. The emergency room was the particular kind of busy that Tuesday nights produce not chaos, but a steady, relentless stream of people, arriving with problems that couldn't wait until morning. A man with a wrapped hand. A young woman with a child on her lap running a fever. An elderly man sitting very still in a corner chair, with the expression of someone who had been waiting long enough that waiting had become its own condition. Aubrey took a seat and filled out the intake form, and wrote workplace accident in the box marked nature of injury, and did not elaborate. The nurse who examined her was a compact woman in her 40s, with reading glasses pushed up on her head, and the unhurried efficiency of someone who had seen everything and retained the capacity to care about all of it anyway. She looked at the swelling above Aubrey's eye, darker now, the bruise fully surfaced, the split in the skin small but visible, and she looked at Aubrey's face while she looked at it. And she asked the question that the form didn't ask, but that her job required her to ask. "Did someone do this to you?" Aubrey met her eyes. It was a workplace accident. The nurse held her gaze for a moment. Then she wrote something on the chart and continued the examination without pressing further, because she had learned, over many years, that pressing further in this particular type of moment rarely produced what it was intended to produce, and sometimes produced the opposite. What she wrote on the chart was her own assessment, separate from what the patient had said, and it would remain there in the record regardless of what anyone chose to call it. The diagnosis was a moderate contusion above the right orbital bone, no fracture, no concussion, though they kept her for observation for 90 minutes to be certain. They gave her ice and something for the pain, and told her to follow up with her own doctor within 48 hours, and to return immediately if the headache worsened or her vision changed. She sat in the observation bay with an ice pack pressed to her eye and stared at the ceiling tiles and thought about nothing, specifically, which was the mental discipline she had developed for moments when thinking about something would cost her more than she could currently afford to spend. Franco arrived at 10:15. He came alone, which surprised her. No men at the entrance, no reorganization of the room around his presence, just a man in a dark suit, walking through an emergency room, with his hands in his pockets, and his eyes finding her immediately across the space, the way eyes find things they have been looking for. He pulled a chair to the side of her bay and sat down without asking if he could. She noted this, but said nothing about it. He looked at her face, at the ice pack, at the bruise darkening beneath it, and something moved through his expression that was gone before she could fully name it. "How bad?" he asked. "Manageable," she said. "That's not what I asked." She looked at him steadily. "It's the answer I'm giving." A silence settled between them, not uncomfortable, but weighted. The kind of silence that accumulates between two people who have already been through something together and are now navigating the aftermath of a second thing that neither of them planned for. "You didn't have to come," she said. "No," he agreed. "I didn't ask you to." "You didn't ask me to pull your employer's business license either," he said. "That happened regardless." She lowered the ice pack. Her eye was swollen enough now that the lid was heavy, half closed against the bruising. She looked at him with the eye that still opened fully, and her expression carried something he recognized. Not gratitude, not anger exactly, but the complicated interior weather of a person who has strong feelings about self-sufficiency and has just watched it be circumvented by someone else's decision. "I never wanted this," she said. "Any of it. I took the job. I did the work. Whatever happened in there tonight, whatever you're doing to him, I didn't ask for that." "I know you didn't," Franco said. "Then why?" "Because you didn't have to push me out of the way of those bullets either," he said. "And you did it anyway." The words landed in the space between them and stayed there. She had no immediate response for them, not because she lacked one, but because the argument she had been constructing in her mind had been built on the assumption that she could separate what she had done 6 months ago from what he was doing now, and his sentence had just removed the wall between the two things and left them standing adjacent to each other in a way that was harder to dismiss. She looked down at the ice pack in her hands. "I don't want to become someone who needs protecting," she said quietly. It was the most honest thing she had said all evening, and she said it to the ice pack rather than to him, which was the only way she could say it at all. Franco was quiet for a moment. "There's a difference," he said finally, "between needing protection and being protected. One is a condition. The other is a choice someone else makes because of who you are." She didn't answer, but she didn't argue either, which, for Aubrey Hilda, was its own kind of answer. From somewhere down the corridor, a door opened and voices spilled briefly into the hallway, a doctor speaking quickly, a family asking questions, the ordinary urgent music of a hospital doing its work. Then the door closed and the quiet returned. "The women he hurt before you," Franco said. "They're coming forward." Aubrey looked up. "2 of them," he said. "Possibly 3. Something shifted in her expression, not surprise, but the particular look of a person who suspected something for a long time and has just been handed the confirmation and doesn't quite know yet what to do with the relief of it. She pressed the ice pack back against her eye. "Good," she said softly. It was one word, small and plain, and carrying the full weight of everything she had endured in 8 months of kept silence. Just one word, but it was enough. They met in the shuttered diner at 11 the following morning. Franco had arranged it. Not through negotiation, there was nothing to negotiate. And both men understood this, but through a phone call made by one of his people to Ethan's cell at 7:45, while the city was still deciding what kind of day it intended to be. The message had been brief and specific. The address, the time, the instruction to come alone. Ethan had listened to all of it without interrupting and said yes, in the voice of a man who had spent the night understanding that no was no longer a word available to him. The diner looked different in the morning. Without customers, without the dinner rush, without the amber warmth of the evening lights doing their work. It was simply a room smaller than it seemed full, older than it appeared busy. The chairs were still pushed back from where people had left them the previous night in their quiet exodus. A shattered plate fragment had been missed in the sweep near the counter. A single curved shard of white ceramic catching the flat morning light from the window. The open sign was still dark. Ethan arrived 3 minutes early. He looked like a man who had not slept, because he was a man who had not slept. The flesh was gone from his face, replaced by something grayer and more permanent looking, the specific pallor of a person whose body has processed a significant shock and not yet recovered its baseline. He was wearing the same shirt as the night before, collar still open. He had not shaved. His eyes moved around the room when he entered, taking inventory of it, the way you take inventory of something you are already beginning to understand. You are losing. Franco was already there. He was seated at a table near the window, not at the head of it, not positioned for dominance, simply sitting in a chair the way a person sits when they have arrived early and are comfortable with waiting. A coffee cup was in front of him, untouched. He wore a different suit from the night before, dark gray, no tie. The tattoos at his neck were partially visible above his collar. He looked rested in the way that certain people look rested regardless of circumstance, because their interior state is not governed by the events immediately surrounding them. Ethan sat down across from him without being invited to. It was, Franco noted, the last independent gesture he would make in this room. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The morning sounds of the street filtered through the glass, a delivery truck idling, someone's music from a passing car. The city's ordinary, indifferent noise that continued regardless of what happened inside the buildings it surrounded. Franco let the silence run. He was patient with silences. He understood that silence, applied correctly, did more preparatory work than most opening statements. Ethan broke first. "Whatever you think happened last night." "I know what happened last night," Franco said. "I was there." Ethan stopped, recalibrated. He pressed his hands flat on the table, a grounding gesture. Aubrey might have recognized it, the instinct to find something solid when everything else is moving. "I've been running this place for 11 years, Ethan said. 11 years. I've employed people in this neighborhood, fed people, kept the lights on through things that would have finished most operations twice over. That has to count for something." Franco looked at him with an expression that was not unkind, exactly, but was completely without give. "It counts for what it is," he said. "It doesn't offset what you did. It was a moment, one moment. I lost my 3 complaints, Franco said quietly, 2 settlements, 5 former employees who left without references rather than stay. 1 woman who relocated her entire family to a different part of the city because she didn't feel safe remaining in the same neighborhood as you." He paused. "One moment is not what this is, Mr. Henry." Ethan's jaw tightened, then released. The fight that had lived in that jaw for 11 years was losing its conviction in real time, and the losing of it was visible, a slow structural surrender, the face of a man whose defenses have been dismantled so thoroughly that even the instinct to defend is beginning to understand it has no remaining material to work with. "What do you want?" Ethan said. His voice was flat, stripped down. "I want you to understand something first," Franco said. "Before we discuss arrangements, I want you to understand that the woman you struck last night is not a person who came to me for help. She has never asked me for anything. Not 6 months ago when she had every reason to. Not last night when she was sitting in an emergency room with a bruised eye. She is not under my protection because she sought it. She is under my protection because she earned it. There is a difference, and I need you to understand that difference before anything else is said in this room." Ethan looked at him. Something moved through his face. Not remorse, not yet, but the precursor to it. The uncomfortable stirring of a man who has spent years not thinking about the people he has hurt and is being made, with some force, to think about one of them now. "She saved my life," Franco said simply, "and you hit her." The weight of those 2 sentences in that order was considerable. Franco let Ethan carry it for a moment without relief. Then he placed a document on the table. It was a single page, clean, spare, the language precise, a transfer of ownership agreement for the property and business assets of Riley's Diner, signed already on Franco's side. The line for Ethan's signature was at the bottom, next to a figure that represented fair market value for an establishment with outstanding health violations, a suspended equipment note, and an active tax inquiry, which was to say, a figure that was honest but not generous. Option 1, Franco said. You sign this. You take what's offered. You leave the city quietly, and you don't return. Ethan stared at the document. Option 2, Franco continued, his voice carrying no additional weight because it needed none. I step back. I allow the regulatory processes currently active against this establishment to run their natural course. I allow the women who have decided to come forward to do so with whatever support they require. I allow Meridian Financial to pursue the equipment note through standard legal channels. He paused. And I close this place for you, permanently, with nothing left for you to take when it's finished. Ethan's eyes moved from the document to Franco's face and back to the document. Outside, the delivery truck pulled away. The street noise settled back into its ordinary register. A pigeon landed on the windowsill and regarded the room briefly and left. Ethan picked up the pen. His hand was not steady, but it moved. And when the signature was done uneven, graceless, the handwriting of a man signing away the architecture of 11 years in a single motion, he set the pen down and did not look up for a long time. Franco folded the document and placed it inside his jacket. Leave the keys, he said. Ethan reached into his pocket. Set the keys on the table. They made a small sound against the laminate final and plane, and carrying the specific weight of a thing that is finished. He stood. He did not look around the room. He walked to the door, and he opened it, and he stepped out into the ordinary morning without looking back. The door swung shut behind him. Franco sat alone in the empty diner for a moment, in the flat morning light, in the silence of a room that was already becoming something else, and drank his coffee. It had gone cold. He drank it anyway. The city talked. It always did. That was the nature of neighborhoods like this one, tight-grained, long-memoried, the kind of place where news traveled not through screens and notifications but through the older, more reliable infrastructure of people who knew each other's business, because they had been standing close enough to each other for long enough that proximity had become its own form of intimacy. Word moved through Aldwych and Fifth the way weather moves through a corridor quickly, completely, touching everything it passed. By Wednesday morning, every regular who had eaten at Riley's in the past year knew something had happened. By Wednesday afternoon, the shape of what had happened had become clear enough that the specifics were almost secondary. By Wednesday evening, the name Franco Davila had been spoken in connection with the diner enough times that even people who had never set foot inside the place understood the basic architecture of the story. The closed sign stayed dark in the window. People walked past it on their way to work and slowed without fully stopping, the way people slow when they pass the sight of something they weren't present for but feel connected to anyway. A woman who had worked the morning shift at Riley's 3 years ago and left without giving a reason stood on the opposite sidewalk for a long moment, looking at the darkened window, and then walked on without speaking to anyone. The man in the dark jacket, the one who had been sitting at the corner table during the incident, who had risen halfway from his seat when Ethan's elbow connected and then sat back down, told the story to 4 people over the course of 2 days. He told it accurately, which was unusual for stories of this kind, because he had been close enough to see everything clearly and was the sort of person whose memory for detail was better than his discretion about sharing it. By the time his version reached the 6th person, it had accumulated 2 additional details that he had not included and lost one that he had. This was also usual. What remained consistent across every version, across every telling, across every kitchen table and corner store and bus stop where the story landed, was the central image, a young waitress with a bruised eye, standing in the wreckage of what she'd been carrying, not crying, not collapsing, holding herself together in a room full of strangers, while something shifted around her that she hadn't asked for and couldn't have stopped. That image traveled. It had the quality that certain images have, simple, visual, morally unambiguous, that makes them resistant to distortion. People received it and held it, and passed it on without needing to alter it, because it was already complete. What also traveled, more slowly and through different channels, was the other part of the story, the part about the ambush, the cold street. The girl who had shoved a dangerous man out of the path of gunfire on an autumn evening and walked away without wanting anything for it. This part of the story came from different sources. People who were adjacent to Franco's world, who knew pieces of things without knowing all of it, who assembled the connection between that night and this one, and understood what it meant about the kind of man Franco Davila was and the kind of debt he carried. The neighborhood adjusted its understanding of both of them accordingly. Aubrey came home from the hospital on Wednesday morning to the apartment she rented on the 4th floor of a building 2 blocks from the diner. It was a small apartment, 1 bedroom, a kitchen that was also part of the living room, a window that looked out onto a fire escape, and beyond that, a narrow slice of street. She had furnished it carefully and minimally, the way people furnish spaces when they are not certain how long they will stay, but want to feel, while they are there, that they belong somewhere. She made tea. She sat at the small table by the window. She held the mug with both hands and looked at the fire escape and the slice of street beyond it, and allowed herself, in the privacy of her own space, to feel the full weight of the previous evening in a way she had not permitted herself to feel it while anyone was watching. It was considerable. Not the physical pain, though that was present. The bruising had darkened overnight into something vivid and uncomfortable, and the area above her eye was still tender enough that certain expressions cost her. It was the other thing. The accumulated weight of 8 months of endurance, of kept silence, of showing up every shift and absorbing what Ethan's diner required her to absorb because she needed the work, and had decided that needing the work was not the same as being defeated by what the work demanded. She had told herself that for 8 months. She sat with the mug getting cooler in her hands and looked at the fire escape and thought about the 2 women Franco had mentioned, the ones who were coming forward. She did not know their names. She did not know what Ethan had done to them specifically, though she could construct reasonable approximations based on what she had experienced herself. She thought about them choosing, now, to come forward, what that decision had cost them, what had made it possible, what it meant that it was happening at all. She thought about whether her own silence over 8 months had made things easier for Ethan. That thought was the most expensive one, and she did not stay with it long. But she stayed with it long enough to be honest about it, because she was, fundamentally, a person who required honesty from herself even when it was uncomfortable. Especially then. Her phone had 17 unread messages. Most were from coworkers, the other waitstaff, the kitchen workers, people who had heard versions of the story and wanted confirmation or wanted to express something and didn't quite know the right words for it. One was from a woman named Dora who had worked the evening shift with Aubrey for 4 months before leaving abruptly in the winter. The message from Dora was 3 sentences long. It said, "I heard what happened. I should have said something when I was there. I'm sorry I didn't." Aubrey read it twice. Then she set the phone down and looked at the fire escape again, and felt something release in her chest that she hadn't fully known was held. Not forgiveness, exactly not yet, and not for Dora to grant or withhold anyway, but something adjacent to it. The recognition that she had not been alone in her silence, that other people had made the same calculation she had made, for the same reasons, with the same weight of consequence behind it, and had arrived at the same insufficient answer. That did not fix anything, but it changed the shape of it. By Thursday, 3 former employees of Riley's Diner had submitted formal statements to the labor board. The statements were detailed and consistent in the ways that matter, independent accounts that converged on the same patterns of behavior, the same climate of intimidation, the same specific kind of fear that Ethan had cultivated over 11 years and called something else. The board opened a formal investigation. The news reached the neighborhood through the usual channels and added another layer to the story that was already accumulating. People who had been uncertain about what to make of Franco Davila's involvement, the discomfort of a powerful man inserting himself into a situation that the law should have handled, the question of what it meant that justice had arrived wearing a dark suit and no tie, rather than a badge, found the uncertainty shifting. Not resolving cleanly, because these things rarely did, but shifting. Aubrey's name was in none of the formal statements. She had not submitted one herself. Not yet. That decision was still sitting with her, still being weighed, still requiring more from her than she currently had available. She knew it would need an answer eventually. She was not ready to give it today. She made more tea. She sat by the window. Outside, the city moved through its ordinary Thursday, with the complete indifference to individual stories that cities have always had and always will. The street below carried its traffic of people going places, carrying things, existing in their own private weather. And on the corner of Aldwych and 5th, the sign in the window of Riley's Diner stayed dark. But for the first time in 8 months, the darkness felt like something ending, rather than something continuing. That was enough. For today. That was enough. Franco came on a Saturday. No call ahead. No arrangement made through intermediaries. Just a knock at the door of her fourth-floor apartment at 11 in the morning. 3 measured knocks, the kind that announce rather than demand. And when Aubrey opened it, he was standing in the hallway in a dark jacket and plain trousers. No suit, no formality. Looking less like the man who had reorganized a room full of people with a quiet instruction, and more like a person who had made a considered decision to show up somewhere and was prepared to stand in the hallway if required. She looked at him for a moment, then she stepped back and let him in. The apartment received him the way small spaces receive large presences, by making the furniture seem slightly more modest, the ceiling slightly lower, the available air slightly more occupied. He stood near the door and took in the room without comment. The careful, minimal furnishing, the books stacked horizontally because there was no proper shelf, the small table by the window with the mug on it that was always there because she was always drinking tea, the fire escape beyond the glass catching the flat Saturday light. "Sit down," she said. He sat at the table. She put the kettle on, because it was what she did when she needed something to do with her hands, and she stood at the kitchen counter while it heated and looked at him across the small distance of the room. The bruising above her eye had moved through its full spectrum over the past days. The vivid purple of the first morning, the complicated greenish yellow of the middle days, and now a fading shadow that was still visible, but no longer the first thing a person's eyes went to when they looked at her face. The split in the skin had closed. She would not scar from it, the doctor had said. There would be nothing permanent. She was still deciding how she felt about that. "I found a property," Franco said. She turned from the counter. "I haven't agreed to anything. I know. I'm telling you about a property." She held his gaze. He returned it with the patient equanimity that she had decided, over the course of knowing him in this limited and unusual way, was either the most disciplined or the most natural thing about him. She couldn't determine which, and suspected it had long since become both. She poured the tea and brought 2 mugs to the table and sat down across from him. "Tell me about the property," she said. It was on Mercer Street, 3 blocks east, a corner unit on the ground floor of a building that had good light and a kitchen that had been used commercially before and retained the infrastructure for it. Not large. Not the kind of place that aspired to be more than a neighborhood establishment. 12 tables, perhaps. A counter with stools. The kind of space that asked nothing of you and gave you exactly what you needed. She listened to all of it without interrupting. "I don't want charity," she said when he finished. "It isn't charity. It feels like charity." "Most things that are given freely feel like charity," he said. "That doesn't make them the same thing." She wrapped both hands around her mug, that gesture he had seen before. In the hospital. The grounding instinct of a person whose relationship with warmth had always been partly practical and partly something else. She looked at the fire escape, then back at him. "You could have left it alone," she said, "after that night. You made your point. Ethan is gone." The women came forward. "It's done." "You could have left me alone." "I could have," he agreed. "So why didn't you?" He was quiet for a moment. Not the silence of a man choosing a strategic answer, but the silence of a man being honest with himself before he speaks, which is a different quality of silence entirely, because what you did that night cost you something, he said. Not materially, but something. You spent 8 months in a job that was grinding you down because you wanted to live honestly and on your own terms, and part of why you stayed in that job past the point you should have was because you refused to let what happened on that street change the conditions of your life. You refused to use it, refused to let it become an arrangement. He paused. That kind of integrity is expensive. I've seen enough of its opposite to know. She didn't speak. "This isn't me changing the conditions of your life," he continued. "This is me acknowledging the cost of yours." The kettle had long since boiled. The tea in the mugs was cooling toward the temperature that tea always reaches when real conversation is happening and no one is managing it carefully. Outside, a child's voice rose briefly from the street below and was absorbed back into the general noise of the city going about its Saturday. Aubrey looked at her mug. "I want my name on the deed," she said. "It will have your name on the deed. I want it structured as a business, legitimate, clean. I handle the operations. I make the decisions. All of them. Yes, and I pay you back. A proper arrangement. Terms I agree to. Not a gift." She looked up at him. "A debt I clear on my own timeline." Something moved through Franco's expression, not quite a smile, but the near neighbor of one, the particular expression of a man who has encountered something he respects and is allowing himself to show it. "Those are reasonable terms," he said. She extended her hand across the small table. He looked at it for a moment. Then he took it a brief, firm handshake. The kind that means something because the people doing it have decided it means something. When can I see the property? She asked. Monday, he said. If you want. She nodded, picked up her mug, drank her tea. He drank his. The Saturday morning held them both in its ordinary light, in the small apartment above the fire escape, in the particular quiet of two people who have arrived, through an unlikely series of events, at something that resembles not friendship exactly, not yet, but the solid, unornamented beginning of trust. It was, Aubrey thought, enough to build from. The grand opening was on a Thursday. Aubrey had chosen Thursday deliberately. Not a weekend, with its implication of occasion and spectacle. Not a Monday, with its associations of obligation and reluctant beginning. Thursday was a working day, an ordinary, unpretentious day that asked nothing of the people who lived through it, and made no promises about what came after. It was the kind of day that suited the kind of place she was trying to build. She had spent 6 weeks on Mercer Street before the doors opened. Not renovating the bones of the space were good, and she had learned from 8 months at Riley's exactly which things mattered and which things were decoration. She had painted the walls herself, a warm off-white that caught the morning light from the corner windows without shouting about it. She had sourced the tables from a salvage place on the east side, solid wood, genuinely worn, the kind of surface that already had a history when you brought it in and didn't need to perform one. The chairs were mismatched in a way that was careful rather than careless. The pendant lights were simple and warm. She had kept the counter with stools from the previous tenant. She had not kept the name. The sign above the door said Hilda's in plain black lettering on a cream background. No flourish, no additional descriptor. Just the name, stated clearly, the way she had decided early on, that she intended to do everything in this place, without unnecessary ornamentation, without apology, without asking permission for the space it occupied. The kitchen she had staffed herself. A cook named Bram, who had worked 3 restaurants in the neighborhood over 8 years, and knew how to move in a small space without wasting motion. A morning prep person named Celestine, who arrived before anyone else and left everything ready and was worth twice what Aubrey was currently able to pay her, a fact Aubrey kept track of carefully and intended to correct as soon as the numbers allowed. The waitstaff were 2 people, one of whom was a young woman named Iris, who had applied with a resume that showed 3 previous jobs in 2 years, each one left without a listed reason. Aubrey had looked at the resume and looked at the young woman sitting across from her in the not-yet-open restaurant and recognized something in the careful way she held herself and had hired her on the spot. She did not explain why. She didn't need to. The first customers arrived at 7:45, before the official opening at 8, because the smell of coffee and something baking had reached the street, and the street had its own opinion about waiting. Aubrey unlocked the door and let them in, and poured the first coffee herself, and set it on the counter in front of a man in a work jacket who had been coming to this corner for years, and looked around the new space with the particular expression of a neighborhood person encountering something that feels right, without being able to immediately say why. "Good place," he said. "Thank you," she said. By 9, the counter was full. By 10, every table was occupied, and 2 people were waiting near the door, with the easy patience of people who had decided the wait was worth it. Bram moved through the kitchen with the efficiency of someone who had been waiting for a kitchen that suited him. Iris moved through the tables with a fluency that surprised even herself, the particular ease of a person who has finally been given a room that doesn't require her to make herself smaller to fit inside it. The morning had a quality to it that Aubrey noticed but did not comment on. A warmth that wasn't only the temperature. A sound, the sound of a room of people eating and talking, and existing in the unremarkable comfort of a place that had been made with care, that was different from the sound she had spent 8 months listening to at Riley's. Not louder, not more cheerful, just more honest somehow, more itself. She worked the counter and the floor both for the first 3 hours, because there was too much to do and she did not yet have the staff to cover all of it, and she did not mind. She had always been most comfortable when her hands were occupied and her attention was demanded, and there was no space left over for the kind of thinking that costs more than it produces. At 11:47, she looked up from the counter. Across the street, on the opposite sidewalk, a man in a dark jacket was standing with his hands in his pockets, looking at the sign above the door. He was not moving toward the entrance. He was simply standing there, at a slight distance, in the flat November light, looking at the place the way a person looks at something they had a hand in making but understand does not belong to them. Franco Davila, he did not come in. She had not expected him to. She understood, without it needing to be discussed, that the relationship between them, that careful, unornamented, newly established thing, had its own appropriate distance. And that distance was not inside this room. This room was hers. The sign said so. The deed said so. The 6 weeks of work, and the carefully sourced tables, and the deliberate mismatched chairs, and the name stated plainly above the door, all of it said so. He was on the outside of it. That was where he belonged, and he knew it. She held his gaze across the street for a moment. Then she nodded, small, direct, the nod of a person acknowledging a debt without reducing it to gratitude, marking a moment without making it larger than it was. He nodded back. Then he turned and walked away down the street, and the city absorbed him the way it absorbs everything completely, without ceremony, without marking the passage of the particular or the significant, and she turned back to the counter, where someone was waiting for a refill, and the morning was full and warm and entirely, completely hers. On the corner of Aldwych and 5th, 3 blocks west, the sign in the window of the old Riley's diner was still dark. It had been dark for weeks. It would stay dark. Some doors, once closed, are meant to stay that way, not as punishment, not as monument, but simply as the necessary ending that makes room for everything that comes after. Aubrey poured the coffee. The room filled with its own sound, and outside, the city moved on. Thanks for sticking with this story until the very end. You're the reason these stories feel alive. If you're ready for another powerful journey, just tap the next video on your screen. And before you go, leave a quick comment and rate this story from 1 to 10. I'm excited to read your thoughts and connect with you in the comments.